Good morning, everybody. How we doing today? Today we're going to talk about a label I don't talk about often, in part because it's so yesteryear for me. We're going to talk about Impulse Records, and I don't talk about them as often as I should. In part because like I said, I collected all this stuff 10, 15 years back, completed the first 150 Impulses, have about 30 or 40 more after that, up to about 240, 50 in that area. And the label starts really shifting at that point. The 70s are in full swing and things have just really changed. Impulse, if you've watched my channel for any length of time or just are independently knowledgeable, you know it's a subsidiary of the ABC label. Creed Taylor was a big impetus behind ABC starting a jazz imprint called Impulse. They started with the wonderful gatefold album covers that were innovative not only in jazz, but in the whole music industry. And soon you had Bob Dylan and the Beatles bringing it to pop and rock, but it wasn't a common thing to see the gatefold compilation. It was really reserved for double albums, and even those weren't super common into the mid to late 60s, So the Creed Taylor gatefold with the lacquered artwork and the beautiful packaging and the great photographs inside, those covers have really stood the test of time. That heavy cardboard, the lovely laminate, they really do look great even 40, 50 years later. But they come on the scene, like I said, in 1960, late in 1960. Basically, they released 4 albums at once for the holiday season in late of 1960. And those 4 records were all fairly important. I will show you one of them right now. I've talked about them before in other episodes. But they want to make a pretty big splash. They're hoping that the downward turns in jazz aren't permanent. And I think there was a great deal of optimism in 1959-60 that jazz was going to make a major resurgence. Albums like Kinda Blue and, of course, Dave Brubeck Time Out sold really well. They made Time magazine. I think that's partly why ABC was willing to launch an expensive jazz label in 1960. And these gatefold deluxe laminate covers, the Impulse records cost, I think, a whole $1 more. I think a regular LP was $2.98 or $3.98, and the Impulse was $1 more. I remember reading that. So they needed to have some pretty big names in order for this to work. And they brought in one of the biggest names of all, Ray Charles, who was working on ABC at the time. They just brought him over from Atlantic. And Charles, of course, makes a big splash. I'm going to show you that LP in a second. But they have an incredible run, Impulse. I'm not going to go too in-depth on it here. But I'm going to show you 24 Impulse titles, 2 dozen, that I think most people should have in their collection. I'm going to cross a fairly wide spectrum of stuff. And there's a lot of really weird titles in Impulse that I didn't even touch or pull out. I could show you 2 dozen Impulses that most people have never heard or seen. It's not the label people think it is. A lot of people have this notion that it's all Archie, Shepp, and John Coltrane and Avant-Garde. And that's far from the truth. And they certainly embrace the Avant-Garde and free. Bob Thiel, when he took over from Creed Taylor after about a year and a half, Creed Taylor had enough and moved on to Verve and brought the gatefold to Verve and changes the direction of Verve rather dramatically. Verve went from being a Norman Graz driven kind of swing era jazz giants in small groups to a lot of those guys having their contracts bought out, and he brought in a lot of talent from the small labels, kind of gutting some of the small labels at Verve and changed their direction rather completely. And it's all kind of a progression to where he ends up at CTI, where he ends up making some of the most commercially viable, poppy, well-produced, well-packaged jazz that at times strains to be defined as jazz. Even with some of the incredible players on there, with such a level of production and arrangement and premeditation to it, that a lot of what's defined as jazz to me gets lost in that shuffle. So we're not going to go any much deeper than that. It's a great label. Like I said, when I first came into jazz, you get into Miles, you get into Coltrane, and Coltrane just kind of spider webs, and a lot of what he does, a lot of his fellow bandmates are making records on Impulse as well. Before you know it, you're buying a McCoy Tyner, you're looking at that Elvin Jones, that Jimmy Garrison, seeing what you can find. So there's a lot of cool stuff happening. But let's dig in. We're going to do these in a kind of a chronological order. For anyone who's curious, we're listening to Charlie Mingus's Piano. Mingus Plays Piano, sorry. Beautiful record. It's just him sitting there playing. And as I've said before, all composers, regardless of what instrument they play, will usually compose on the piano. That's just kind of a given. Guitar would be that second choice, as I said in my guitar series. But the piano gives you a lot of compositional range and melody and harmony, things that a single tone instrument can't necessarily do. A bass can set the roots or even create some melodic lines, but the harmony and structure of the chords that piano brings gives us complexities. Ray Charles, genius plus soul equals jazz. This is number 2 in the Impulse catalog. And Ray had broken out in 1959-60 at Atlantic, had made a huge splash. Hallelujah, I Love Her So. And boy, was one I could hear the ride cymbal on it. Ray Charles, What I'd Say. That's a great song. You can play that at most events, weddings, anniversaries, DJing my brunch. It's a song that they're going to know. Even if they don't know, it's such a great song, What I'd Say. But so they brought Ray Charles over, which was a smart move. And again, he's already on the label, technically being on ABC. And so, and Ray was perfectly capable of playing jazz. And it's a great record. Quincy Jones and Ralph Burns do the arrangements. And you can find this for under $10 sometimes. Again, some of these pricings I might be low on now because I've bought all these so long ago. I can't remember the last time I even bought an Impulse record. But that's really worth seeking out. Number 2 on my list is Oliver Nelson, The Blues and the Abstract Truth. Sadly, this is not an original pressing, which most of my Impulses will be. This record's become very expensive. It's got 2 covers. Oliver Nelson has quite a long history at Prestige New Jazz, making some pretty interesting, complex stuff. He's a great player on the sax, but he starts moving more towards arrangement, composition, and producing sessions even. And he ends up spending most of the 60s producing and arranging at Verve and at Impulse. This is kind of his first foray into these really arranged, yet still wonderfully jazz pieces. This is a really groundbreaking record in a lot of ways, with Paul Chambers, Eric Dolphy, Bill Evans, Roy Haynes, and Freddie Hubbard. And you got some of the greatest to ever do it there. Haynes, Hubbard, Evans, Dolphy. They're all considered, Chambers, they're all considered elite players on their horns. So he really drafts quite a band for this. A5, making it the 5th Impulse release. Stolen Moments is fantastic. There's a lot of tracks on here that is just fantastic. Cascades is beautiful. Very modern. The beginnings of some avant-garde. A record that kind of, I think, sets the table for the 60s. I think it comes out early in 61. And it really, if you think of some of the stuff that Hancock and Shorter and some of those guys start doing, I think this record was a big part of that revolution. A7 is a fantastic record by Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. How he got out of his contract for Blue Note to make this in 61 and ended up back, maybe it's when he goes to Riverside after this and then goes back to Blue Note after that, but he makes 2 one-offs at Impulse. And they're not back-to-back. There's some stuff in between them and different lineups even. This one's the traditional lineup with Curtis Fuller added. And so I think this is got Lee Morgan on it, if I recall. Yeah, Curtis Fuller, Wayne Shorter, Bobby Timmons, and Jamie Merritt. That's a great, serious record. They're really thrusting and pulsing. And I don't think it feels quite like the Blue Note stuff. Maybe a little bit more polish on it, but it's still pretty raw. And Art Blakey's always going to have some thunder to what he does. A13 is the aforementioned Curtis Fuller, who plays on that last Blakey record, who joined the Jazz Messengers around this time. He's one of the great trombone players in the hard bop, bebop movement. He's probably third in my ranking behind J.J. Johnson and Jimmy Cleveland in terms of his dexterity and his playing. You know, he's a great player. He enunciates quite clean. But J.J. Johnson and Jimmy Cleveland are probably that next level above him a little bit, just in ability. But Fuller has a ton of feeling. What Cleveland lacks in his sessions, because he's often just working as a sideman and laying fire on people's tracks, Fuller's more of a complete artist in terms of he wants to do arrangements that matter to him and songs on sessions, on labels, where money maybe isn't even a motive. I get the feeling Jimmy Cleveland made more money as a sideman than some of these guys made as leaders on some of the smaller labels. Fuller's Blue Notes are great. Fuller's Savoy stuff is great. Fuller's records at Impulse, which there's 2 of them, are also fantastic. The other one's called Cabin in the Sky. This one's called Soul Trombone. And he's got his buddies here, man. Hubbard, Jazz Messenger. Jamie Merritt, Jazz Messenger. Cedar Walton, Jazz Messenger. Along with Jimmy Cobb, Jimmy Heath, and a fellow by the name of G.T. Hogan, who I can't remember what he plays. I think he might be a baritone or tuba player, if I recall. Oh, no, he plays drums on some tracks. Maybe they have 2 drummers on it. I don't recall. Again, my mind's a sieve some days. Ace 15. Probably middle of 61. Count Basie in the Kansas City 7. And for those of you who don't know Basie well, or think Basie's just a swing guy, and Basie is really at the fundamental of a lot of the modernity of post-war jazz. And if you take his body of work and his sidemen and how the small groups that they started doing in the 40s and the Kansas City 7, there's just various small incantations of his groups that were very prescient and helped set the table for what was to come in jazz. And he plays organ on some of this as well as piano. And there's some of the most moody, bluesy, soulful. Again, this is not a swing session. These are smaller compositions, smaller groups, but the clever arranging is there. The spatial movements and the dynamics of his compositions and his groups, that's always a prevalent thing. So there's going to be very reduced parts and big loud parts and soft kind of fuzzy parts and clear dimensional parts. It's a lot of interesting affectation placed upon each number, yet there's a simplicity to all of it, which to me is part of the magical balance. I was listening to Tears for Fears last night, and there's a lot of complexity to some of those productions, even some of the chord structures, yet it all has a simplicity to it that makes it very approachable. Of course, the Beatles were kind of the masters of that in a lot of ways, putting interesting innovation in an appealing, appetite-inducing way. Basie, this is a great record, and it's one of those records you can find for under $10. You know, I've often been suggesting to me, you should make an episode on records under $10. And I like to, but then I feel like the second I do it, there's going to be 5 people going, that record right now isn't on $10. There's only copies for 30 and 27. It's like, so I don't want to have to sit there and search what's out there online, you know, because there's grading, all these different variants that go into play. But this time you can find for under $10 in a record store. 15, 20 tops for a nice copy. Number 17, A17, so probably middle of 61 still. The song is Paris by Jackie Paris. And this is probably going to be the toughest one of the toughest ones to find. There's a couple that are going to be pretty tough to find. This one's very hard to come by. Jackie Paris was an East Coast kind of lounge cabaret singer. He played in some supper clubs and has a couple of great records, one on ATCO Atlantic or East West Atlantic, and then he has one on Emerson Mercury's Wing label, which is a great session. But this one's really a beautiful, moody, melancholic set of tunes with lovely productions and arrangement and really thoughtfully put together. Certainly it's a far thing from some of the out that Impulse is known for. This is saccharine sweet but still jazz. Impulse isn't going to give you that RCA Capitol saccharine where it's just meant for station wagons on the way to the mall with the white family. Impulse is always going to have more black and swing and blues and real jazz behind what they're doing. They're going to make sure they book a real jazz band to back anybody. So it's going to always have a validity and a value to it, which some of those major labels make compromises much more frequently. And I will say Impulse makes more compromises, and by this time ABC's kind of climbed into mid-major towards a major label. You know, ABC in 1955 was fairly young and just was being birthed, and they exploded on the scene fairly quickly, in part because of that film industry money behind them, so the distribution becomes really wide quickly. So Impulse does have some economic standards placed on them. We can't just do whatever, but yet at the same time they made a lot of really experimental records that can't have sold very well. So I think the compromise kind of ends up being, for every one really out record, you have to give me 4 or 5 that are going to be commercially applicable. And that's about the ratio. It's about 25% real out, and the other, 80% is pretty much middle of the road to almost soft, wide paved highway without pebbles. Like, some of it's real smooth. This is one of the first signs of where Impulse will be allowed to go, A23. And by this time, of course, Coltrane's already done some things like Africa Brass, and there's a few other Coltrane things that are coming out, kind of announcing the direction the label's going to go. But this record here with the great Roland Kirk on it, Rashawn Roland Kirk, he's a blind multi-horn player. He plays some really interesting, he can play the horns at 2 horns at the same time, sometimes even 3. So he's creating chords, which is what I've said horns can't do. But when you can play 3 horns at once, you can create chords, and those chords create harmonic depth and color. And with a great rhythm section behind it, Tommy Flanagan's in the group, of course. Roy Haynes is on the drums. I gotta look at who the bass player is. I think I know it's Henry Grimes, who doesn't make a lot of records in this era, but he goes on to be a pretty big part of the avant-garde later. There's a song here called Snap Crackle that's really kind of wonderful, and will probably be familiar to a lot of people because I believe it got onto a San Andreas video game, one of those compilation radio things. It's a great record. That Roy Haynes record's become pretty tough to come by, and will fetch $100 nowadays. A27 is Freddie Hubbard, who also makes 2 records on Impulse, just like Curtis Fuller does. And so, like, you see how Impulse has some free, some avant-garde, some pop, some swing era, some blues, some vocal. And for hard bop, they had a couple Blakey, a couple Hubbard, a couple Curtis Fuller. So there's not a defined Impulse sound like, say, at Blue Note or Riverside or Bethlehem. Impulse is just this broad swath of the entire roadway. And we're going to have the edges, but we're also going to have that middle of the road sometimes. And hard bop's kind of course, that high speed lane. Things are churning in the hard bop lane. It's up tempo, it's grinding, it's aggressive, it's got attack. Hubbard's always going to have a clarity and a enunciating quality to what he does that sets him apart from all the other trumpet players. The great Farmers and Blue Mitchells and Lee Morgans and on down the road, Kenny Dorhams. There's a clarity in Hubbard's tone, as well as a incredibly dexterous virility that only Clifford Brown rivals. And I was chatting with somebody the other day about Woody Shaw, and Woody Shaw is an outstanding player who I don't know well enough. He comes into the Blue Note camp in the mid to late 60s as a sideman, and most of his records as a leader come out in the 70s, and I've shied away from a lot of 70s purchases. I just don't even think to search that section. I'm usually searching 50s and 60s. So I don't have any Woody Shaw records as a leader, which is something I need to fix at some point. But Woody Shaw's a great player as well, along with Hubbard, and there's a lot of great trumpet players, don't be mistaken. But as far as that incredibly tactile and precise, machine-like precision, for my money, Clifford Brown and Freddie Hubbard that's what I want to hear. I want that laser beam cutting my die cast, because I know it's going to make a clean cut. Hubbard here is playing with some great members of that same kind of crew. Tommy Flanagan, John Gilmore is on the saxophone, Art Davis on the bass, along with Louis Hayes on the drums. who's a quite young Louis Hayes, and of course Curtis Fuller is also here with him. So those are some of the hard bop stuff that Impulse does. And like I said, they do it pretty well. It doesn't have quite that same Blue Note feel, but it's still fairly true to form. Like every other label in the country, when Bossa Nova hits in '62, Impulse feels compelled to do a couple Bossa Nova records. And they do some of the best Bossa Nova records. And first and foremost, this Desafinado, Coleman Hawkins, Bossa Nova, and Joss Samba. This record is beautiful. It's sand between your toes. You know what I mean? You got to be ready for sand between your toes if you put this on. Don't have no oatmeal stout in your hand, no cognac, no nothing. Like, you got to have a pina colada to go to Desafinado with Coleman Hawkins. Don't mess around. Don't become half-stepping. You better have a towel for the beach. It really channels that wonderful summer wind, as Frank Sinatra once said. It's just breezy and aromatic and fresh and sexual. And again, sexuality is what always propelled jazz. And it propels the Bossa Nova. So Bossa Nova and jazz really gel in that sense, because it's that undulating groove of sexual propulsion. And it's the siren song. That's what lures us in. We could be honky white folk and walk past a place playing some good grooving blues, R&B, early rock and roll, and suddenly all that honky in us wants to sit back and get a little snap on. Because the groove, the funk, the sexuality, we all crave it. You know what I mean? We can't escape it. So Bossa Nova grafts itself really beautifully. One of my favorite records of all time is Duke Ellington with John Coltrane. And who is the leader on this? Ellington really is, in my book. It's kind of a co-led series. And I came to it through Coltrane, make no mistake about it. So I also had my Coltrane section for a long time. But Ellington gets top billing. Ellington's the senior here. Ellington has the compositions here. They actually both showed up with their bands, because that was never clarified beforehand. So you actually have this mix of some of Ellington's sidemen with some of Coltrane's sidemen, which gives it some interesting juxtapositions. Coltrane feels honored to be in the shadow of this giant. And I think even that photograph drives that home sometimes. You just feel there's a reverence there. And yet, coincidentally, I feel like Ellington recognizes in Coltrane this great young prophet. How serious Coltrane was. Ellington could dig, you know. Ellington was a hip cat. Nothing slipped by Ellington. You know what I mean? He didn't play his cards. He kept them close to the vest, but he was reading things at all times. You watch Ellington in interviews, you ask him a question, especially a hard question, he'll smile and put the question back on you. And question your stance and your place and where's your opinion coming from. I'm not even going to answer because I don't know what you're trying to get out of me. So Ellington's a very coy, clever machine, but you know he still saw in young Coltrane this new generation that a bit like a Kendrick Lamar today, where even the old cats say, okay, he's the ascending king. He's going to wear the throne someday, the crown. And I can't say enough about My Little Brown Book. And one of my favorite songs of all time is, I often get it wrong, it's In a Sentimental Mood, I'm pretty sure, yeah. I also want to call it one of his other great songs. In a Sentimental Mood on here is one of the most beautiful, minimalist, gorgeous pieces of jazz and composition you'll ever hear. And I would argue that for most people, if you're not a jazz fan, there's not a better place to come in than that record. It's a wonderful place. And if you're looking for one Impulse record to have, you might want to start right there. I love this record, Nights of Ballads and Blues. It's one of my first McCoy Tyner solo records. And you hear him from out from under the broad wings of John Coltrane. When you play in the John Coltrane Quartet, the room is going to be occupied by that man's inscriptions. The temple walls are going to be filled with the words of John Coltrane. And so you get to do some coloring, and you may get to chisel a few things here and there, but there's not a whole lot of room for you to tell the McCoy Tyner story. And McCoy's a very clever player. If you listen even on some of his versions of My Favorite Things, his pulsing, dynamic, he's just a really clever, yet rhythm and blues inflected player who gets overlooked a little more than he should. His records are starting to climb in value, though, for sure. But he's playing kind of more in a ballad setting here. And for me, it was a great introduction to McCoy's sound, because that's not something you hear as much when he's in the quartet. So, wonderful, wonderful McCoy Tyner. Moving on to A56. This is the great Yusef Lateef. And by 56 now, Thiel's firmly in charge. Creed Taylor's moved on. And Thiel's the musician's producer. He definitely lets the guys do what they feel from the source, from the well inside. I don't feel the oversight's nearly as strong once Bob Thiel's in charge of the ship. There's still some commercial stuff being put out. You need to keep the label viable, of course. But the resurgence in jazz just doesn't really happen commercially. And so by the time this comes out, probably in 63, and Yusef's had quite a track record already. We've talked about Yusef quite a bit lately. His satellite records are very elusive from 57, 58. It's taken me a long time to get all 7 of them. He goes to Riverside and New Jazz, Prestige, and makes some really great records there. He's introducing a lot of world sounds and instruments. A Detroit native, part of that great Detroit lineage of jazz musicians. And here he gets to Impulse, and he makes probably 5 or 6 records in Impulse over the next couple of years. They're great records, and he's really given a lot of free license to use players and instruments as he sees fit. It's even called Jazz Around the World, and it's the perfect kind of instrument right there. It's the perfect kind of blank canvas for a guy like Yusef Lateef to be able to write on. In the second half here, one of my top 10 records probably of all time easily is I Just Dropped By to Say Hello by Johnny Hartman. We know of Johnny Hartman through John Coltrane, and that Johnny Hartman, Johnny Coltrane record, everybody should have that as well. Easily could have put that on this list, but I feel like that one's a little bit almost too obvious, so I went with I Just Dropped By to Say Hello. Illinois Jacquet is on here. He's fantastic. I believe Jim Hall is on some of this. Some of the sidemen are just fantastic. And I would go so far as to say Hank Jones on the piano. He's just wonderful. Kenny Burrell's on some of this as well, along with Milt Hinton and Elvin Jones. And I would go so far to say, if I had to pick one jazz vocal record, it would probably be this one. The pedigree of musician behind Hartman here is so wonderful, so modern. Hank, Jacquet are just bringing this wonderful color and minimalism and soft touch. Hank doesn't need a hammer over your head. He's not going to come in and splash paint everywhere. Hank just wants to brush a little on that little spot right there. And then Illinois Jacquet, he just feels a little bit of this fuchsia needs to drop in. And so they're just giving this minimalist filling around the words. And they're doing standards here. And there's not many people that I would say, if you want to know these standard songs, you say go to Sinatra for the most part. Ella Fitzgerald maybe. But if Johnny Hartman did it, I say go to Johnny Hartman. Hartman's big baritone voice, but it's smooth and full of caramel and luxury and the velvet glove of his wonderful voice. It's just a wonderful, soothing sensation. And he does every song that he does in the American Songbook. His version for me is a seminal version. Like a Billie Holiday, he can really get into the lyric of the song, and he doesn't inflect himself into the piece like a Billie Holiday does in that sense. But he's always just kind of doing the song like Ella, where he's just doing the song to the best of his ability, how the song he feels. When Billie does it, she makes it hers. And she puts her sorrow and her experience and almost translates it into Billie Holiday's language. When Ella or a guy like Johnny Hartman or even Sinatra, when they do songs, they're trying to take their skill set and graft it into the composer's ideation to the best of their ability. They want to make the song the reverence. And it's about that composition. And let me do the best tribute to that piece that I can. And Billie Holiday's always like, I don't give a fuck what they meant when they wrote that song. When I sing it, it's going to be about how I feel about my life's experience. So there's different ways you can be a jazz vocalist. It's not really a right or wrong. But like I said, if I had to pick one jazz vocal record, the Johnny Hartman's a wonderful place. And he's going to be more stuck to the melody. He's not going to do a lot of deviation and flourish like some singers would. But still that baritone richness and that sense of really feeling the lyric, it's as good as it gets. What we're listening to here is Charlie Mingus's piano. Mingus plays piano. And all composers play piano. It's just a given. And I think a lot of us are surprised when we see a bass player or a trumpet player or a trombone player playing piano. But Bob Brookmeyer with Bill Evans, there's infinite examples of guys who don't play piano who play piano. It's a powerful instrument. And if you have any compositional bones in your body, when you sit at it, you're going to be compulsed to write and arrange. It's all laid out in front of you in this mathematical sequence. And so you can just feel chords and blocks, and the dissemination of the musical vocabulary is all there for you to type at will. And so whether you're a Thelonious Monk or a Charles Mingus, the piano gives you an incredible palette with which to color. And it's really beautiful solo piano stuff. It's none of his dissonance, none of his big group composition and arrangements. There is some discoloring by just him and himself, because the piano can be very orchestral. But for the most part, it's just really deep, melodic, thought-provoking composition. And I've loved this record for 15, 20 years probably. And honestly, it's probably my favorite Mingus record. As much as I recognize his innovation, Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, Pithecanthropus erectus, a lot of that stuff takes you to be in the mood for it a little bit. It's a bit like some of that Frank Zappa stuff. I have to be in the mood to hear Freak Out. But I can always play Mingus at the piano and just be wrapped up by not a traditional sense either. It's not like a Teddy Wilson record where he's playing standards and giving you a lot of rhythmic propulsion and coloring on top of standard melody. Here he's just kind of, it feels very much ad-libbed, very fresh and very just, this is what came out today. 4 for Train by Archie Shepp, A71. By this time, Coltrane's made incredible inroads and really helped change the face of jazz. And by no means was he the lone impetus for that. Like in yesterday's episode, we talked about Jimmy Joffrey doing things back in the 1940, 54, 55 that were very avant-garde. But Coltrane, with the carte blanche he's given at Impulse, coupled with the distribution that Impulse had, really allows him to put some pretty out there music in the public realm. And it opens the doors for a lot of other great players, including Archie Shepp, who can be fairly inside the lines, but also is capable of going really outside the lines. Become very tough to find. And this one's called 4 for Train, an obvious tribute to his dear friend and influence, John Coltrane. This one's not as out as some Shepp stuff gets. If you're going to start with Shepp, you probably want to start with that. Number 85, John Coltrane Quartet plays. And I wanted to pick a second Coltrane besides just the Ellington. And there's a lot of things I could have chosen. So many great records. Tracks like Alabama, The Love Supreme, Crescent has a great record. But I went with this one a little bit off the beaten path, in part because I love the song Nature Boy so much. One of the most beautiful melodies of all time. Bobby Darin's version of Nature Boy to me is one of the most beautiful songs any pop song has ever been written. And I play DJing quite often if the setting's right. And I'll always get 2 or 3 people, usually be the one that's 24 and one that's 68. And they'll both come to me like, one will be like, oh, who is this? This is great. And then the old lady will come on and be like, who is that? I can't remember who this is. It's such a great song. And of course, the old lady doesn't have Shazam. The young cats nowadays don't ask the questions like they used to, because they sit there with their phones up to the sky going, what the hell is this? And as a DJ now, you look for that. That's part, you used to look for people to come up to you and talk to you. But now as I scan the room, I'm always looking for people Shazamming. because that to me tells me that they're interested in what I'm doing. If no one's Shazamming it, either everybody knows it or I shouldn't be playing it. Great record. It's the Quartet nearing the end of their run. From 61 to 65, the John Coltrane Quartet makes an incredible body of music. And by 65, Coltrane's mortality is looming, and his directions are changing due to that. And he's bringing in Rashid Ali for some stuff. He's bringing in Pharaoh Saunders for some stuff. And it's getting to the point now where McCoy isn't even heard sometimes because there's so much cacophony happening with two drummers. The bass, Jimmy Garrison, and Jimmy stays with them quite a long time. But eventually Alvin and McCoy both leave, and they both go back to very much more straightforward jazz when they leave. You know, Elvin Jones makes some very straight blues, R&B based jazz after he leaves Coltrane's group, because you've pushed the limits. You've seen the outer edges of the galaxy. You don't really need to dive into the black hole any deeper. If you're Elvin Jones, you don't mind going back to a nice, quiet star system where you can just flip a few planets around. So Elvin Jones, it's great stuff. And Coltrane, that it's not the first one you should get, but it's certainly a Coltrane record worth finding, and it won't cost you as much as some. Here, speaking of Elvin Jones, A88, probably 1964 or 5. This is with the great Charles Mariano, which is partly why I picked this. I'm a big Charlie Mariano fan. Mariano makes some great work at Bethlehem in 54, 55. His 3 albums there are all outstanding. He does some side work with some other Bethlehem cats like Stu Williamson and Claude Williamson and Frank Rosalino. That whole group of cats, I'm big fans of all those records. And Mariano was just this fiery guy that was really laying down the Max Bennett records. Mariano was great on those. So I really became a Mariano fan through my Bethlehem exploration. And then I rediscovered some of my Impulse records, which I already had this Charlie Mariano guy in the 60s. And Mariano by that time had really kind of evolved into kind of an avant-garde edges player. He's not Coltrane or Ornette Coleman, but he's certainly pushed his own limits out from the hard driving, upbeat cool that they used to do. I hate to call that West Coast stuff they were doing as cool, because it's more hot cool, you know. But here he's with Elvin Jones. Hank Jones is on this. His brother, Richard Davis, and Roland Hanna round out the group. It's powerful stuff. It's called Dear John C. for, of course, his dear friend John Coltrane. And I don't believe Coltrane's passed at this point yet. But, so he's probably still in, or maybe just left. I'm going to have to look at the date in here, see if it says it. Recorded in February of 65, so yeah, he's still in the Coltrane group. But this record is a departure from some of the more out stuff. Remember in 65, Coltrane's recording stuff like Cool Let's Say Mama and Ascension and what would essentially be 40-minute spiral sonic cacophonic hurricanes. You know what I mean? Ascension's a sonic hurricane. Both sides of it will just swirl around in your head until you have to flush everything inside your brain. It'll clean you out like a colonic. It's quite powerful. So I think there was parts of Elvin that were kind of craving to play more at the center of the sound. This is a tough record to come by. Maybe the toughest one here. This one I didn't pull Danny Richmond, who drummed for Mingus for years, with the Soup Can. That's a tough record to find. The Jackie Parrish record, tough to find. And then this John Lee Hooker record, very tough to come by. And it shows you, again, Impulse, recognizing the roots of jazz is deep in the blues. And it's a pretty straightforward blues session. It's up-tempo. It's got some horns on it if I recall, so it's not like a stripped-down just guitar blues session. But it's a wonderful, very hard record to find. And even second and third pressings fetch $150. Original pressings are really rare. Really great stuff. A103, probably 1965 as well. Moving on. I don't want this episode to get too long here. Chico Hamilton. Again, Charlie Mariano's on this one, which is partly why I picked it. Gabor Szabo's on this one, the great Hungarian gypsy guitar player who plays on a number of Chico records and also makes 7 or 8 great Impulse records himself. I just talked about him recently, so I didn't include him today, but you gotta love Gabor Szabo. Clark Terry, the fantastic trumpet player of Ellington and Basie fame. The great Ron Carter's on bass. the aforementioned Charlie Mariano, and then of course the great Jerome Richardson, who's one of the great unheralded flautists in jazz, and also a great woodwind sax clarinet player. You gotta love anything Jerome Richardson's on. He brings color. He brings. If Herbie Mann's here and Eric Dolphy's here, Jerome Richardson's right in the middle. He's gonna give you more edge than Herbie, but he's not gonna shriek at you like an Eric Dolphy might. So you gotta love Jerome. He always brings a great sustenance to any sessions he's on. It gives some meat to anything. You see Jerome Richardson, grab it. Trust me, it's great stuff. He's a bit like Sonny Clark. He's gonna add some serious meat to the gumbo. Great stuff. I love all Chico's work, whether it's with Jim Hall at Pacific or here with Gauber and company. Chico's a very forward-thinking guy by this point. His stuff that was back at Pacific Records is a bit more chamber with the cello, and it still swings, but it's that crossover thing. By here, he's still doing crossovers, but he's edging into the avant-garde and some world sounds and some blues and swing. Like, he really brings a lot of disparate sounds together, and he's a great drummer to boot. You can't go wrong with Chico on Impulse. Anything he did there was fantastic. And again, because Mariano was on that, I grabbed that one. Sonny Rollins makes 3 records on Impulse that I think are great. People always talk about Alfie, the soundtrack, and I think it gets a little more love than it deserves. It's a great record, but people act like it's this brilliant thing sometimes. I don't quite get that. I think East Broadway Rundown, for me, is my favorite of his Impulse works. It's an intense, bright, invested Sonny Rollins. Like my child sometimes, when they're not invested, they don't give you great work. But when they are paying attention, when they are motivated, and they feel like they got something to say, they can be interesting things. And Rollins is one of those guys where I feel like some of his sessions, it's more of a process, and he just has a hard time, I think, stirring it up when he's not feeling it. Or, you know, some guys can't help but feel it. A guy like Coltrane puts a horn to his lips and fire at the devil comes out. Rollins has to be more in that mood. If you listen to him on the Vanguard record on Blue Note, he's completely focused and just on fire. Saxophone Colossus, he's absolutely brilliant. But there's times where he feels a little bit more blasé, perhaps. But I think on this East Broadway Rundown, he's got this bright, seeking focus, and he just seems to be searingly. I just really think he's got on fire on this. It's one of his better records, I feel like, and I don't think he gets quite the credit that a lot of people give to some of his other work. But I think that's a really great session on Impulse. Now we're talking 126, probably 66 by this point. This is Roswell Rudd, and he's a trombone player. One of the last trombone players to come along in this era, hard bop era. The trombone starts becoming more and more disused after 1960, along with the trumpet. Those brass horns start going into disuse more and more. The saxophone starts taking over. Guitar, organ become more prevalent. Soul jazz. For a lot of the out free stuff, the saxophone gives you those honks and those blurts and those weird ways you can bend and break notes. The trumpet is a more difficult thing to play, as is the trombone. So a lot of these free guys just wanted a sax they could express on. And honestly, I could pick up a sax and make you some stuff that sounds free jazzy. It wouldn't make it good, you know, but I'd have a hard time playing anything on a trumpet that sounds like a trumpet. And same with the trombone. But Roswell Rudd is a very interesting player, and this record is out. He's one of the more out guys that I think even a lot of the out people kind of forget about. Giuseppe Logan's on the flute and the bass clarinet, Charlie Hayden's on the bass, Beaver Harris on the drums, Robin Kenyatta on the alto, and Louis Worrell is on the bass as well. It's really a cool record. Not the easiest listen, but again, it's a great brushstroke showing you the dimensions and the breadth of what Impulse Records was willing to do. And if you like the avant-garde, it's a record worth looking for. The Waiting Game by Zoot Sims. This is by, again, 66, 67, maybe probably 66, number 131. And I love Zoot. He's a wonderful tenor player that has a real breathiness. Zoot is kind of, to me, the Chet Baker of the saxophone. He can play bright and up tempo, but when you get him down tempo, Zoot Sims is just a dream. I was listening to the Undercurrent outtakes with Bill Evans, where he plays on the Undercurrent record has Freddie Hubbard, but there were some other sessions that ended up being coupled together on Milestone in the 80s. I played on one of my last Throat Grabbers, and the Zoot Sims Bill Evans stuff just killed me. I love Zoot Sims. His body of work in part suffers because as a white musician, he's often playing with other white musicians. He's often at white labels, and I think he's a guy that would have benefited by being more frequently around the brothers, because he certainly has a wonderful spirituality and sense of sorrow to his playing. I love Zoot. And this record doesn't cost that much. You can probably find it for 20 bucks. A worthy thing to find. Almost done here. Number 160, Heavy Sounds, Elvin Jones and Richard Davis. This is a tough record to come by nowadays. We'll probably push 100 bucks most of the time. Some pretty edgy stuff here. Really driving stuff. The band here is with, of course, Richard and Elvin, with Billy Green on the piano and the great Frank Foster on the tenor sax. And Elvin and Bob Thiele there together playing the piano. Beautiful album cover. Beautiful laminate. Just gorgeous stuff. It's modern. It swings. It's got a darkness to it. It's just a really cool record, and it's really hard to find and worth grabbing if you ever see it. And last but not least, number 181, Pharaoh Saunders, Karma. And Pharaoh kind of cuts his teeth with Coltrane in 65 and in 66. He's kind of an unofficial member of the group, ends up becoming an official member. And as Coltrane descends into his free-blowing, cathartic kind of exercising the demons of pain and life and suffering, Pharaoh's his right-hand man. And they really kind of go down that road together. There's a spirituality that's a component of what Coltrane does, and Pharaoh definitely picks up on that. And so there's a lot of spiritual jazz that's kind of almost marketing spiritual concepts and language in the way where heavy metal would use dark satanic imagery the same way. It became a bit of a marketing thing to a certain clientele. We want those hippie, resistance fighter, spiritual, conga playing, revolutionary, philosophical. It appeals to those people, this kind of world spirituality. And in some ways it appealed to me, and still does. It still does appeal to me. I love that idea of a world consciousness and a world global spirituality. It's where we need to get. And more attention on space and the cosmos would make us feel more unified here in our vulnerable blue marble. And that's something I keep wanting to drive home, is if we had more of a human consciousness. And my brethren, my group, my family I belong to is human earthling. No more, no less. You know, I've often said that the average American has become more American than human through the processes of education and the media and how we see the world and what matters to us, our lack of geography and connection to our past. We've become very isolated in how we think and feel. We're American, and earthling human should come before American as a definition. And imagine if you had a can of shelf of canned tomatoes, and there's 20 different varieties of cans. And one section of cans is saying, we're not tomatoes, we're Del Montes. That's a dumb tomato. Because if I peel all the labels off all these cans, throw them in a pile, good luck plucking yourself out of that mix. Y'all just tomatoes. And so nation is a label that we wear. We think it defines us because it's where we came out of someone's vagina, but it doesn't mean nothing. Nations are very short temporal things. They're economic entities. When you cross a border, language and religion, those things, culture don't change. Economics changes instantly. How much you pay for a tank of gas changes instantly. How much you pay for a cup of coffee. Those nations, and those are economic constructions meant to enforce economic policies. They're not these cultural defining boundaries that I can't go across that border and recognize the humanity in you. Because that's not what's dividing us. We're not being divided by race and religion and language and all these cultural phenomena. Those things have bled across the borders of the world, and most of them existed long before there was a border to cross. We're part of a great human migration that makes us all human earthling. Aborigine, got it. It's me. Chinese, yin yang, I'm part of that. We'll go back to ancient Africa if you want to go Australopithecus. I'm part of all of it. I can't not recognize myself as being anything less than human earthling. That's all I can define me as. Any other definition falls short. So I've peeled it off my ingredients. It's not on my label no more. My label says human earthling. Have a can of that. Be that. To be more than that is to be propagated, to be controlled how they want you to think. And it's that thinking of nationalism that gets us so into a logjam of control and divide and fear and hate. It's a dangerous path to go down. And empires are the most empirical in that teaching of nationalistic doctrine. So peel off those labels and be a tomato. Don't be ridiculous and call yourself a national entity, because it doesn't define you. Those things are very temporal. And when you cross those borders, again, it's economics that changes. And when you break down nations in that way, you realize how little they mean, how short they've been around. To make them my be-all, end-all for how I define myself is very short-sighted. And if you live in an educational vacuum where you don't see beyond that, it's very easy to think that that's the depth of your being. But when you study history long enough, you recognize that, boy, there's so much more to my lineage, to my story, to how I am who I am, than just the nation I happen to be born in. It's not like I had to reinvent the wheel and restart fire for the first time because I came out in Canada and we weren't connected to something before. We're connected to all those collected pasts. And now all those collected pasts are part of my identity and how I see myself and how I want to converse with anyone I meet from anywhere. My wife and kids often comment how I'll just stop and talk to anybody from anywhere in the world and have a commonality with them. And because of my base in knowledge in geography and history, I can interact and share and feel comfortable and not threatened because I'm not scared of what I understand. I'm not scared of Vietnam. I'm not scared of Taiwan. I'm not scared of Libya. I'm not scared of anybody. You want your kids home safe at night and food in their stomachs, just like me. And there's a freedom in that. There's a freedom in taking the flag out of your yard and saying, you know what? I don't need the flag. Because in a way, you're prohibiting me from being free by controlling how I think and what I say, and what I watch, and what you want me to feel and who you want me to hate and fear. Peace.